He was a financial genius from 2025, but one night a deadly crash tore him out of his world. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer Ethan Cole from New York, but Jacob Miller, a poor farm boy in Kansas in the year 1910. No internet, no computers, no Wall Street, only debt, dry soil, and a bank notice threatening to take his family's farm. But he still had one powerful weapon: modern financial knowledge and a programmer's mind burning inside a young farmer's body. From a struggling wheat field, he began testing new ways of farming, new ways of keeping books, and new ways of negotiating that no one had ever seen before. He founded the Prairie Star cooperative, built grain elevators, created the Prairie Gold brand, and dared to stand up to the powerful grain companies and railroad monopolies. Friends betrayed him, the rich tried to crush him, and the whole town was torn between fear and hope, but he refused to give up. Step by step, this time-traveling young man turned a bankrupt farm into the first billion-dollar agricultural empire on the American prairie. This is a story of intelligence, courage, love, and a journey to become a billionaire while still wearing muddy boots in the fields. If you want to know how his battle ends, stay with me and listen to the full story, starting right now. Chapter 1. Waking Up in the Wrong Century. The storm over New York had looked like any other. Ethan Cole, 28, tall and lean with a face bleached by office lights and too much coffee, gripped the steering wheel as rain turned the highway into a sheet of black glass. Neon smeared across his windshield, horns blared, and his phone buzzed with another email about risk models and deadlines. He blinked once at the glare of oncoming headlights, felt the sickening skid of rubber losing grip, then a flash of white, the crunch of metal, and silence. He woke choking on dust, not city smog or burnt rubber, dry, earthy dust that clung to his throat and smelled of hay and old wood. Above him, instead of a hospital ceiling or the cracked interior of his car, he saw rough-hewn beams and a roof patched with tin sheets. Light knifed in through gaps in the boards, full of drifting specks of straw. "Jacob, Jacob, can you hear me?" The voice was a woman's, soft but ragged with worry. Ethan turned his head and saw her, a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair twisted into a loose bun, a faded blue dress, and hands roughened by years of work. Her face might have been pretty once, before exhaustion carved fine lines around her brown eyes. Those eyes, though, still burned with stubborn warmth. This must be Mary Miller, he realized a moment later, though he had no idea how he knew her name. Beside her stood a man with broad shoulders and a sunburned neck, his shirt sleeves rolled up, suspenders crossed over a chest hardened by field work. His jaw was square, his hair already threaded with gray despite being in his mid-40s, and his expression was a mix of sternness and tired pride. This was Caleb Miller, the kind of man who spoke little but carried the weight of his family and his land in silence. At the foot of the narrow bed was a girl, maybe 10, with freckled cheeks and a mass of blonde hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Her dress was patched in several places, but her gray eyes sparkled with quick curiosity and fear. Grace Miller, Ethan's mind supplied, as if someone were flipping through memories that belonged to him and didn't, all at once. Ethan tried to sit up. Pain flared across his ribs, but it was nothing like the crushing agony he'd expected after a car crash. His hands weren't the hands he knew. No pale programmer fingers with faint keyboard calluses, but tanned, knotted hands with dirt beneath the nails and small scars from old cuts. "Easy there, son," Caleb said, putting a steadying hand on his shoulder. His voice was low and gravelly, the voice of a man who had shouted across fields more than he'd spoken in boardrooms. "You took a hard hit to the head in a barn, fell clean off the loft, scared us half to death. Barn, loft, not highway, not airbags." Ethan's brain spun. He remembered code, charts, the glare of multiple monitors, the chatter of traders. He remembered his father back in 2008 sitting at the kitchen table with a foreclosure letter and eyes that looked as if someone had turned out the light inside him. That moment had carved Ethan's life into before and after. Before the crisis, when he believed adults were in control, and after, when he swore he'd master the language of money so his family would never be blindsided again. He had grown into a quiet, intense man, tall and slightly stooped from hunching over screens, with dark hair always a bit messy and eyes that never fully relaxed. Colleagues liked his brain more than his small talk. He knew how to read numbers better than he knew how to read people. And yet here he was, in someone else's life, in someone else's body. "Jacob," Mary whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead with trembling fingers. "You don't remember the fall? You were up in the loft after chores, and then we heard the crash." Jacob. The name thudded in his chest like a foreign heartbeat, and then, faintly, images flickered behind his eyes, running across these fields as a boy, the taste of dust and wind, a schoolhouse at the edge of town, a woman in a long skirt writing on a chalkboard, Miss Hart, Lily Hart, a boy his age laughing on a wagon, Tommy Brown. They came like half-remembered dreams, not his, but close enough to make him dizzy. I'm okay," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. Even the sound felt different, higher, younger. "Just, my head's a mess." Mary smiled through tears. "Head knocks will do that. Thank the Lord you woke up at all." Caleb cleared his throat. "We'll give you time to rest," he said, "but there's something you should see when you're steady on your feet." His gaze flicked toward the small wooden table in the corner of the room, where a folded piece of paper lay like an accusation. The moment they stepped outside, the room seemed to grow bigger and quieter. Ethan swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood, a bit unsteady. The floorboards creaked. Every sense screamed that this was real, too real to be a dream. He crossed to the table. His fingers shook as he picked up the paper. It wasn't a text message or a printed email. It was a letter, thick cream stock, edges slightly frayed, ink smudged where someone's thumb had pressed too hard. At the top, in ornate black lettering, were the words, "Prairie Bank and Trust. Foreclosure Notice." His stomach dropped. The rest of the words blurred for a moment, then snapped into focus. Overdue payments, interest, final warning, property to be seized if debts were not settled by the end of the season. It was the 1910 version of the letter that had broken his father. Only this time it was addressed to Caleb Miller, and the name on the line that said occupant, tenant farmer, was Jacob Miller. He took a shaky breath and moved toward the small window. Outside, the world stretched open in a way New York never did. A pale blue sky curved over endless fields of wheat, their green-gold heads swaying in the breeze like a living ocean. A narrow dirt road ran past the house, carrying the distant clatter of wagon wheels. The air smelled of soil and sunlight, with a hint of manure and wood smoke. No honking taxis, no skyscrapers, no humming servers, only wind and birds and the distant whistle of a train. Jacob? He turned. Mary stood in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour. Up close, the shadows under her eyes seemed deeper. Lily Hart stopped by from the schoolhouse, she said. Wanted to see how you were. Behind her, on the porch, stood Lily. She was in her early 20s, tall and willowy, with chestnut hair braided and pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her dress was simple but clean, a faded green that made her eyes, soft hazel, thoughtful and bright, stand out. Ink stains marked her fingers, and there was a smudge of chalk on her sleeve. Her posture was straight, almost stubbornly so, like someone who had learned to stand up to the world even when the world didn't listen. "Hi, Jacob," she said, stepping into the light. "Your mama said you took quite a fall." Her voice was gentle, but there was a keen intelligence beneath the kindness. Lily Hart was the sort of person who watched everything and forgot nothing. For a heartbeat, Ethan simply stared. Some buried part of Jacob's memory stirred. Afternoons in the small wooden schoolhouse, Lily's patient explanations, the way she slipped extra sums onto his slate because she knew he liked numbers. "I guess I did," he managed, forcing a crooked smile. "My head's still catching up." Lily studied him, her brow furrowing just a little. "You sound different," she said, "but maybe that's just a knock." She offered a small, encouraging smile. "The boys at school will miss teasing you if you don't come back soon." He huffed a quiet laugh. Teasing. School. None of the kids in his old life had teased him. They'd mostly ignored him until he started making ridiculous money. "I'll be back," he said. "I think." Lily nodded, though her eyes lingered on him a second too long, as if she were filing away this new version of Jacob for later. Then she squeezed Mary's hand, promised to send over some extra reading for him, and headed back down the dirt road toward the distant shape of the schoolhouse. From the side of the house came the bang of a barn door and a boy's loud voice. Ethan glanced out to see Tommy Brown, lanky and loose-limbed, with straw-colored hair sticking out from beneath a battered hat. Tommy's shirt was untucked, his boots dusty, his grin wide even as he hoisted a heavy sack of feed like it weighed nothing. Tommy's eyes held a restless sparkle, the look of someone who dreamed of trains and city lights even while his feet were stuck in the mud. "Hey, Jacob," Tommy shouted, waving an arm. "You dead or just lazy?" Mary clucked her tongue. "That boy," she muttered, but there was fondness in it. Ethan lifted a hand in weak reply, the motion automatic, half his own and half Jacob's. That night, after Lily had gone and Tommy had ridden away on his squeaky-wheeled wagon, Ethan sat alone on the front steps of the farmhouse. The prairie stretched into darkness, the wheat now just a shadowy ripple under a sky filled with more stars than he'd ever seen above Manhattan. The air was cool, carrying the distant hoot of an owl and the lowing of a cow. In his hands he held the foreclosure notice. The paper felt heavy, like it carried not just ink, but the weight of every bad harvest, every unfair price, every broken promise to people like the Millers, people like his father, years later, in another world. He didn't know how he'd come here. He didn't know if he could ever go back. But he knew numbers. He knew systems. He knew the ruthless rhythms of markets, the tricks of banks, the way leverage could either crush you or lift you. And for the first time since he woke up, A thought came into sharp, cold focus. If he couldn't save his father's farm in 2008, maybe he could save this one in 1910. Ethan Cole, inside Jacob Miller's body, looked out over the sleeping fields of Kansas and made his first decision in this new life. He was going to keep this farm, whatever it took. Chapter 2, Dust, Ink, and Interest. Morning on the prairie came with a rooster's scream and a hard, white light that slid through the thin curtains and dragged Ethan from a restless sleep. His body still ached from the fall, Jacob's fall, but the pounding in his skull had settled into a dull, manageable throb. The smell of frying bacon and coffee drifted in from the kitchen, richer and more real than any break-room espresso. He swung his legs off the narrow bed, feeling the rough wood under his bare feet, and pulled on the worn work pants and shirt folded over a chair. The clothes hung differently on Jacob's wiry 17-year-old frame than his tailored suits ever had on Ethan's taller, leaner body, but they moved with a quiet familiarity that wasn't his. When he stepped into the kitchen, Mary was at the stove, hair pinned up, sleeves rolled to her elbows. A cast-iron pan hissed, and a pot of coffee bubbled on the back burner. Grace sat at the table, kicking her feet in the air, plaiting and unplaiting the end of her braid. Caleb stood by the window, staring out at the fields with his arms crossed, shoulders already tense for the day. All three turned when he entered. "You should still be in bed," Mary said, though relief softened the scolding. "Head knocks don't heal overnight." "I'm fine," Ethan replied, "or fine enough." His gaze drifted to the corner cupboard, to the small wooden box he'd noticed last night. He cleared his throat. "Pa, I need to see the papers." Caleb's brows knit. "What papers?" "The ones from Prairie Bank, the ones about the loan, and any receipts, seed, rail, equipment, all of it." There was a beat of silence. Grace stopped swinging her legs. Mary's hand paused over the pan. "What for?" Caleb asked, suspicion edging his tone. "Because I've spent the last 10 years of my life reading the world through numbers," Ethan thought. "Because that letter in the corner looks too much like the one that ruined my father. Because if I don't understand exactly where the hole is, I can't plug it." He pulled out a chair and sat down, trying to look like a farm boy making a simple request instead of a displaced analyst about to audit a century-old debt. "I just need to know how bad it is," he said more gently. "If I'm going to help, I have to know what we're up against." Mary exchanged a look with Caleb. It was the look of two people who had carried a burden together so long it had become part of their posture. Finally, she wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the cupboard. The wooden box creaked as she lifted it down and set it on the table. Inside were folded letters, brittle receipts, and a thick, narrow notebook with a cracked brown cover. Caleb came over, reluctant but resigned, as Ethan opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Mary's careful handwriting. Dates, bushels, prices, a record of every debt and payment for years. Ethan leaned forward, the way he always did over a spreadsheet. The columns of inked numbers steadied him. Here, at least, was a language he spoke. He traced the entries with his finger. Seed bought in spring. Fertilizer. Fees to the rail company for shipping wheat to the elevator in town. Interest payments to Prairie Bank and trust. The interest column made his jaw tighten. "What's the rate on the loan?" he asked. Caleb scratched at his jaw. "Started at 6%. And now? Went up to 8 last year. Bank said times were hard, folks defaulting. They had to protect themselves. Ethan flipped through, counting silently. The jump in interest, the fees added when a payment was late because a harvest had come in short. Little cuts, each justifiable on paper, all of them together a slow bleed. He grabbed a stub of pencil from the box and, on a blank page, began scribbling. He built a crude table. Year, amount owed, interest, total paid. His handwriting was messier than Mary's, but fast, numbers spilling out in neat rows. He adjusted for yields, for price changes he vaguely remembered from articles about early 20th century commodity markets. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Mary and Caleb watched, baffled, as the boy they knew as Jacob moved the pencil with the focus of a man used to juggling millions. Grace leaned in, fascinated, though she clearly didn't follow the math. "Here," Ethan said finally, turning the ledger so they could see. "If you keep paying like this, with the interest where it is, even with a good harvest, you barely touch the principal. One bad year," he tapped the column marked by last season's shortfall, "and you fall behind enough that they can justify calling the loan, which is what they're doing." Caleb's mouth flattened. "So, you're saying we're sunk?" "I'm saying the way the loan is structured, it's set up so that most people fail," Ethan replied. "But if we can renegotiate, stretch the term, lower the rate for a while, buy time, and if we can increase your yield, there's a path where this farm doesn't get taken." Caleb snorted softly. "And you think Henry Whitaker is just going to nod along while my boy tells him how to run his bank?" "Who's Henry Whitaker?" Ethan asked, though the name rang a bell from the foreclosure notice. "Bank manager," Mary said. "Tall man, gray hair, always in a suit, even on the hottest days. Fair enough, I suppose, but he follows the rules. And the rules say when you can't pay, you lose the land." Caleb added, "He fought in some panic years back, saw runs on the bank. Man's got fear of chaos baked into his bones." That told Ethan plenty. Whitaker was a risk manager bound to the past, afraid of liquidity crises. If he could be convinced that giving the millers time reduced risk, not increased it. "We need to go talk to him," Ethan said. "Today." Caleb opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. What he saw in Jacob's eyes wasn't the dreamy boy who stared at the horizon while plowing. It was something sharper, more decisive. "You think you can talk a banker out of his own letter?" he asked slowly. "I think I can show him the numbers in a way that makes sense," Ethan answered, "and ask for a chance to fix the rest." After breakfast, they hitched the old bay horse to the wagon. The horse, a big gelding with a white blaze down his nose and patient brown eyes, snorted and stamped as Caleb secured the traces. "That's Duke," Grace told Ethan proudly as she climbed onto the wagon seat between them. "He's older than me, but he still pulls better than any horse in the county." Duke flicked an ear at the praise, the picture of calm endurance. The road to town was a ribbon of hard-packed dirt cutting through the sea of wheat. Under a pale, high sun, the fields shimmered like dull gold. They passed other farms, some with paint peeling from the barns, others with fences sagging. Now and then they overtook another wagon, families heading the same way with baskets of eggs or crates of produce. People raised hands in greeting, their faces lined by sun and work and worry. As they neared town, the landscape shifted. The fields thinned, replaced by scattered houses, then a cluster of buildings along a single main street. The white steeple of a church, a brick general store with wide front windows, a blacksmith shop with smoke curling from a chimney, and, at the far end, a 2-story red brick building with tall windows and a polished brass sign, Prairie Bank and Trust. Beyond the town, near the railroad tracks, a wooden grain elevator towered over everything, its shadow falling across a dusty yard where wagons queued in a long line. Above the office door hung a painted sign, Harrington Grain Company. Men shouted, horses shifted, and the smell of grain dust hung in the air. Ethan watched as a frail-looking farmer in a sweat-stained shirt argued with a clerk in a bowler hat over a slip of paper. The clerk, a thin man with a pointed nose and ink on his cuffs, shrugged and pointed at the posted prices on a board. Prices that, even in Ethan's fuzzy understanding of 1910 markets, seemed brutally low. A few yards away stood Charles Harrington himself, if Ethan had to guess. A man in his 50s with a barrel chest and a neatly trimmed mustache, dressed in a light-colored suit and spotless hat that set him apart from the dust-covered farmers. Harrington's smile was wide and his handshake firm as he chatted with a local official. But his eyes were pale and calculating, flicking over the wagons the way a butcher might appraise cattle. Ethan filed the image away. That was a problem for another day. Today's problem had brick walls and ledgers. Inside Prairie Bank and Trust, the air was cooler, shaded by high windows. A tiled floor led to a wooden counter with brass bars and small glass windows. A young clerk with reddish hair, a spatter of freckles and round spectacles, Simon Reed, according to the small nameplate, looked up from a stack of forms. Simon had the cautious, eager look of someone who desperately wanted to be useful and not make mistakes. "Mornin', Mr. Miller," Simon said, recognizing Caleb. "You here to see Mr. Whitaker?" Caleb nodded. "If he's in." Simon hesitated, then gestured toward a frosted glass door marked Manager. "He's between appointments. I'll ask." He slipped through the door, leaving Ethan staring at his warped reflection in the polished brass fixtures. A moment later, the door opened again. "Mr. Whitaker will see you now," Simon said. Henry Whitaker's office was modest but orderly. A large wooden desk stood near the window, its surface neat. Inkwell, blotter, ledger books stacked in precise piles. Behind it sat Whitaker himself, a tall, slightly stooped man in his late 50s, hair silver and combed back, a trimmed mustache matching his hair. His suit was dark gray, well-made but conservative, and his tie knot sat perfectly centered. Steel-rimmed spectacles rested on the bridge of a nose that looked like it had been broken once and healed imperfectly. His gray eyes were cool, assessing, the eyes of someone who had seen panic and ruin and decided he would never be caught unprepared again. "Caleb," he said with a brief nod, "and Jacob." His gaze lingered on Ethan a fraction longer, taking in the boy's posture, the alertness in his eyes. "I heard about your fall. I trust you're mended?" "Getting there, sir," Ethan said. Whitaker opened a drawer and pulled out a familiar sheet of paper, the foreclosure notice. "I assume you're here about this?" Caleb shifted his weight, clearly preparing to launch into the same plea he'd probably practiced in his head all morning. Before he could speak, Ethan stepped forward slightly. "Sir," Ethan said, keeping his voice respectful, "before we talk about the letter, could we look at the loan itself?" Whitaker raised one eyebrow. "The loan?" "Yes. The rate, the term, how it matches what the farm can realistically produce. Ethan met his gaze steadily. I've been going over our books. There may be a way forward that doesn't end with you owning another piece of land you don't really want. That earned a flicker of interest. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, steeple in his fingers. Go on. Ethan took a breath. He walked through the numbers as simply as he could. He didn't say amortization schedule, but he explained how the interest increase had put the Millers on a path where they could pay faithfully and still fall behind. He didn't mention expected value or price volatility, but he talked about how a single bad harvest, like last year, could shove them into default even if the long-term outlook was solid. If the bank calls a loan now, Ethan said, you get the land, yes, but you also get the cost of maintaining or reselling it, and you turn a family that's been paying you for years into debtors who can't pay you anything more. If you extend the term by 1 season, keep the rate from climbing again, and give us a chance to improve yield, you keep a paying account instead of another empty field. Whitaker's jaw worked. And what makes you think you can improve your yield enough to make a difference? Because last season we farmed the way we always have, Ethan said, and this season we won't. He thought of the trial field he wanted to create, of better drainage, rotation, careful seeding, hundreds of small optimizations. I've been studying, sir. I know we can get more from the same ground. Whitaker turned to Caleb. This your idea or your boys? Caleb hesitated, then surprised himself. Mostly his, he admitted, but the numbers he showed us, they made sense. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant clack of the telegraph in the front office. Then Whitaker sighed softly, as if arguing with himself. He reached for a ledger, flipped it open, and ran a finger down a list of names. I have 37 farm loans on my books, he said quietly. Some will fail no matter what I do. Some can be saved if the weather's kind. A few might actually prosper if given room. His eyes lifted to Ethan's. I do not make a habit of rewriting contracts. It sets a precedent. People talk. I understand, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to forgive what we owe, just to give us time to earn it. Whitaker studied him for another long beat, then nodded once, sharp. Very well. I will authorize a 1-season extension. Interest will not rise this year. You will make interest payments on schedule and bring me a report after harvest showing your yields. If you fall behind again, there will be no further negotiation. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Ethan said, relief mingling with the weight of new responsibility. Whitaker made a note in the ledger, signed the margin with a precise flourish, and slid the foreclosure notice back into the drawer. Don't make me regret this, Jacob, he said, voice almost gentle. Farmers and bankers both drown when the river runs too fast. Outside, the sun was higher, the street busier. Caleb walked a little straighter beside the wagon, as if a stone had been lifted from his chest. Grace chattered about candy in the general store. Ethan barely heard her. His mind was already moving, running scenarios the way it once had for hedge funds and trading desks. They had time now. Not much, but enough to try. As Duke pulled the wagon back toward the shimmering fields, Ethan looked once more at the line of wagons outside Harrington Grain, at the bowed shoulders and tired faces, and thought, it's not just us. This whole system is tilted. But for today, one small piece of it had shifted in their favor, and that was a start. Chapter 3. the field that shouldn't work. The day after the visit to Prairie Bank dawned thin and cold, a weak sun pushing through a veil of high clouds. The air had the sharp, damp scent of ground that hadn't quite decided whether it was finished with winter. Ethan woke before the rooster, the echo of Whitaker's words still in his head. One season, one chance. He pulled on Jacob's worn boots and stepped outside. The farm lay quiet. A gray barn, the low line of the house, the vast, waiting fields. Beyond the yard, the wheat was just a fuzz of green across the soil, neat rows disappearing into the distance. It was beautiful in a way that hurt. If he was going to bend this world's odds, it would start here. He walked the edge of the fields with his hands tucked into his pockets, testing the soil with the toe of his boot, breathing the cool air. Toward the back of the property, near a shallow dip in the land where rainwater tended to linger, he found what he was looking for, a small, slightly poorer patch that Caleb hadn't sown yet. The ground here was heavier, more compacted, and the kind of spot farmers avoided or planted grudgingly. Perfect. If he could make this piece outperform the rest, no one could say it was just luck. At breakfast, Mary set a plate of biscuits and eggs in front of him, eyeing the tired lines around his eyes. Caleb drank his coffee in small, deliberate sips. Grace hummed some half-remembered hymn under her breath, swinging her legs as usual. "I want to use the back strip for something different," Ethan said once they'd all taken a few bites. Caleb looked up. "Different how?" Ethan took a breath. "The way we plow and plant, everyone does it because that's how it's always been done. But the soil back there is tight. It floods when it rains. If we change how deep we plow, put in narrow drainage ditches, and mix manure with straw and kitchen scraps right instead of just dumping it, we can get more out of it." Caleb frowned. "We've been farming this land longer than you've been alive, boy." "I know," Ethan said, careful to keep his tone respectful. "And I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying the world's learned some things since. I've read about other methods, rotating crops, treating the soil like something alive instead of just dirt. We don't have time to change everything, but we can try on one patch, just that strip." Mary wiped her hands on her apron. "If that patch fails, we lose seed we can't get back. If we do nothing, we lose the whole farm," Ethan said quietly. "If it works, we have proof, something we can use to convince others, maybe even get a better price for better grain." Caleb stared at him for a long moment, the clock ticking slowly on the wall. Grace watched them both, chewing on the edge of her biscuit. "You're serious," Caleb said at last. "Yes, sir." Another stretch of silence, then Caleb sighed. The sound was half annoyance, half reluctant hope. "Fine, you get your strip, but you do the work yourself. If it goes wrong, the rest of the field doesn't suffer." A spark of relief flared in Ethan's chest. Deal. The next days blurred into a new rhythm. He started with the plow. The farm's plow was old but solid, iron blade dulled by years of cutting the same way through the same dirt. Ethan took it down from its hooks and examined it like an engineer, running his fingers along the edge, thinking of diagrams he'd once seen in textbooks about soil compaction and tool angles. It wasn't enough to have an idea. He needed help turning it into steel, which is how he found himself back in town, standing outside the low, smoke-stained building that housed the blacksmith and the Harrington stables. The blacksmith shop was all heat and noise, Inside, a broad-shouldered man with a black beard and arms like tree trunks hammered a glowing horseshoe on an anvil. That was Elias Turner, the town's blacksmith, a man in his 40s whose thick forearms and leather apron told a lifelong story of metal and fire. His face was stern but not unfriendly, streaked with soot, eyes the pale blue of someone used to squinting against sparks. "Need something, Jacob?" Elias called over the ringing of metal. "Just borrowing Samuel a minute, if that's okay," Ethan said, lifting the plow blade he'd brought in the wagon. Out back, near the stables where Harrington's horses were kept, a man was oiling a set of harnesses. He was tall and lean, with dark brown skin and close-cropped black hair beginning to gray at the temples. His hands moved with careful precision, long fingers strong but gentle as he checked each buckle. His work shirt was faded, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms lined with old scars. This was Samuel Carter, the stable hand everyone simply called Sam. He was in his early 30s, older than Ethan but younger than Caleb, and there was a wary calm in his eyes, a practiced watchfulness that came from a lifetime of knowing one wrong word to the wrong person could cost more than a job. He had come north from the south after his father had been attacked by night riders for standing too proud, and that memory had carved caution into him without killing his dry humor. "Jacob Miller," Sam said as Ethan approached, his lips twitching. "What brings you to the rich man's backyard?" "I need to bend steel," Ethan replied, holding up the plow blade, "and I thought you might know a thing or two about making stubborn things change shape." Sam chuckled softly. "Flattery? Must be serious." He took the blade, turned it in his hands. "What are you thinking?" Ethan knelt in the dirt, drawing a crude sketch with a stick, a slightly different curvature, a sharper angle, narrow wings to cut and lift the soil instead of simply pushing through it. He explained as best he could without words like aeration and microbiology. Sam listened, brows climbing. "You sure you ain't hit your head harder than they say?" "Pretty sure," Ethan said. "Look, if it doesn't work, I'll put it back how it was. But if it does, maybe we get more wheat from the same land." Sam studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, farm boy. Let's see if we can teach this old thing new tricks." Together, with Elias's occasional grunted input, they heated and hammered and filed the blade into its new shape. Sweat slicked their faces, shirts sticking to their backs. Elias mostly lectured about how steel has its own mind, but there was interest in his eyes too. He'd seen plenty of tools, but not this design. By the time Ethan rode home with the modified plow, the sun was dipping low, smearing orange across the sky. Grace met him in the yard, jumping up and down to see what he'd brought. "Looks funny," she declared, poking the curved edge. "Funny is what we're going for," Ethan told her. "Funny enough to feed us." Word spread faster than he expected. The first morning, he hitched Duke to the new plow and turned it toward the back strip. Old Mr. Jenkins appeared at the fence line. Harold Jenkins was a neighbor in his 50s, with a sagging belly, a thin line of gray hair around his bald crown, and a permanent squint from years of staring into sun and dust. He had the demeanor of a man who believed the world had once made sense and had gone downhill ever since. "Mornin', Caleb," he called, though his eyes were on Ethan and the odd plow. "You let the boy take up blacksmithing now?" Caleb, fixing a gate post nearby, just grunted. "He's trying something." Looks like he's trying to ruin good iron, Jenkins said, chuckling. Land don't like tricks, Jacob. It likes respect and doing as your father did. Ethan forced a smile, though his hands tightened on the plow handles. We'll see what it likes when harvest comes, he said. He set Duke moving. The modified blade bit the earth differently, curling the soil up in looser, airier ridges, leaving narrow channels between for water to travel. It was harder at first. Every muscle in his arms and back protested. But there was a strange satisfaction in watching the land respond, furrow by furrow, to a pattern he'd only seen on a whiteboard in another life. For days, he worked that strip differently from the rest. He dug small drainage ditches leading off the natural low spot, lined them with stones where he could find them. He spread manure in thinner, even layers, mixing it with straw and ash instead of piling it in corners to rot. He walked the field at dusk, checking moisture with his hands, adjusting where needed. Mary watched from the porch sometimes, arms folded, worry and reluctant pride wrestling on her face. Caleb didn't say much, but he turned his head more often toward the back when he thought no one noticed. Grace followed Ethan like a shadow, asking 100 questions. "Why do you put the dirty stuff in the ground?" she asked one afternoon, nose wrinkled as he forked compost. "Because the plants like it," Ethan said. "It's food for them." "Plants eat dirt?" "Kind of," he replied, smiling. "They eat what's in the dirt. Little pieces of things that used to be alive. It's how the world recycles." One breezy day, a cluster of children appeared at the edge of the field, Lily Hart among them. She wore a straw hat against the sun and carried a small satchel of books. The children behind her were a ragtag group in overalls and faded dresses, faces smeared with dust and curiosity. "We're doing a field lesson," Lily said, an amused glint in her eyes. "I heard one of my students is attempting to defy every farming manual in the county." "Guilty," Ethan said. He explained as simply as he could what he was trying to do, using stones and clumps of soil as props. Lily listened intently, head tilted, hazel eyes bright. The children mostly enjoyed the part where he dug worms out of the loam and declared them helpers. "You really think you can grow more than your father out of that patch?" one boy asked skeptically. He was a freckled kid with a cap too big for his head and the suspicious look of someone used to disappointment. "I don't just think it," Ethan said. "I'm counting on it." As spring ripened into summer, the difference began to show. From the farmhouse, the fields all looked green, but up close, the back strip was subtly different. The wheat there stood a little taller, stems thicker, color a deeper, healthier shade. After a heavy rain, water puddled in the lower fields, but the test patch drained more quickly, tiny channels carrying excess away. Even Jenkins stopped by, leaning on the fence, chewing a stalk of something. He didn't say anything, but his squint sharpened as he scanned the rows. When harvest finally came, the sun was a hot coin in a pale sky, and the air shimmered with heat. The prairie hummed with the rasp of cicadas and the rhythmic swish of scythes. Caleb decided, at Ethan's urging, to cut the back strip separately. They worked it by hand, Ethan and Caleb and even Grace dragging a small wooden wagon, stacking bundles of wheat. Mary brought water in a tin pail, her face flushed, apron damp with sweat. By late afternoon, they had a small mountain of wheat from that single strip. Ethan, chest heaving, grabbed the old scale from the barn. Together, he and Caleb weighed bundle after bundle, Mary noting numbers on a scrap of paper. When they totaled it, Caleb went quiet. He redid the math himself, lips moving silently. "It can't be right," he muttered. "It is," Ethan said softly. "That strip yielded half again as much as the same size in the main field." Grace whooped, nearly knocking over the scale. Mary covered her mouth with one hand, eyes shining. From the road, someone clapped slowly. They turned to see Tommy Brown perched on his wagon seat, hat pushed back, sweat-damp hair stuck to his forehead. Tommy's grin was wide, but there was something complicated in his gaze. "Looks like the crazy field worked," he called. "Maybe you really did knock some sense into your head when you fell." "Maybe," Ethan replied, smiling despite the ache in his muscles. Farther off, nearer town, a carriage rolled past on the main road. Inside, behind the glass, a man in a light-colored suit glanced toward the Miller farm, eyes narrowed as if measuring something. Charles Harrington's gaze lingered on the unusually thick patch of grain and the small cluster of celebrating figures before the carriage moved on in a cloud of dust. Ethan didn't see him. He was too busy staring at the numbers Mary had written down, at the proof in ink and sweat that the land could give more if treated differently. One season, Whitaker had said. Now Ethan had something to show for it. Not enough to save the farm yet, not by a long shot, but a starting point. A tiny, stubborn wedge he could hammer into the cracks of an old system. As the sun bled into the horizon and the sky turned the color of cooled embers, Ethan stood at the edge of the test field, hands on his hips, shirt plastered to his back. The smell of cut wheat and dust filled his lungs. For the first time since waking up in 1910, hope felt less like a wish and more like an equation starting to balance. Chapter 4. The Idea of We. The numbers from the test field didn't stay secret for long. By the end of the week, half the township seemed to have that Miller boy's crazy patch worked into their conversations, usually somewhere between talk of the weather and the price of nails. Some told the story with curiosity, some with amusement, and a few, like Harold Jenkins, with a tone that said accidents sometimes happened to men who tempted fate. For Ethan, the higher yield was more than a curiosity. It was proof. Proof that the land could give more if treated differently. Proof he could take to bankers, to stubborn fathers, to anyone who still thought that's how it's always been done, was a plan and not a slow death. But as he watched wagon after wagon still rolling up to the Harrington Grain elevator, individual farmers bargaining alone for a few cents they couldn't afford to lose, he understood something else. Fixing one farm was not enough. He couldn't outthink the system just for himself. He had to change the way the whole town played the game. One evening, after chores, the Miller kitchen smelled of stew and fresh bread. The lamp on the table cast a small pool of yellow light. Mary kneaded dough with sure hands, her sleeves dusted with flour. Caleb sat in his usual chair, cleaning his pocket knife with slow, methodical strokes. Grace lay on her stomach on the floor, drawing crooked horses on the back of an old feed sack. Ethan spread the ledger on the table and set a scrap of paper beside it. On it, he'd sketched boxes and arrows. Farmers, Harrington, City Mill, Bakery, Bread. Next to it, another set of arrows. Farmers together, better price, less debt. "What are you drawing there?" Mary asked, glancing over while she worked the dough. A picture of how we get cheated, Ethan said. Then he caught himself and softened his tone. And maybe how we stop letting it happen. Caleb snorted. You already got the banker to give us more time and the field to give us more grain. Now you want to fix the Harringtons of the world? Yes, Ethan said simply. At least our piece of them. He tapped the first line of arrows. Right now, each farmer hauls his wheat alone to Harrington. Harrington sets the price. If one of you protests, he buys from the next man in line. If the mill in the city complains about quality, he blames you. All the risk is on you. All the leverage is on him. Grace looked up at the word. What's leverage? It's... Ethan searched for a comparison that didn't involve margin calls. He grabbed a butter knife and balanced it on his finger, then put a small potato on one side. If I push here, he said, pressing down on the other end, I lift more weight with less effort. That's leverage. Harrington has the lever. You're the potato. Grace giggled. Caleb frowned. Mary hid a smile. Ethan flipped the paper and drew again. But if you all sell together, one big stack instead of 20 little piles, you have something he wants more. Quantity he can't easily replace. You demand a fairer price, and if he refuses, maybe you take that big stack to someone else. Someone else where? Caleb asked. There's one elevator close enough to haul to. Harrington's. Closer doesn't always mean better, Ethan said. The mill in the city, who do they buy from? Mostly Harrington, Mary said. Sometimes a man named Mason comes through, buys for his brother's mill. But he doesn't stay long. Mason, Ethan repeated, a secondary buyer, a crack in Harrington's monopoly. If we can promise him more grain at once, he might offer a better price than Harrington. That's where the leverage flips. Caleb leaned back, knife forgotten. You're asking men who barely trust their own kin to trust you with their crop, he said. You know that? I know, Ethan replied. I also know most of them are one bad harvest away from losing everything, like we were. Fear makes men stubborn, but it also makes them listen when you offer a rope. Mary dusted her hands and wiped them on her apron. What exactly are you proposing? A cooperative, Ethan said. A group that buys and sells together. We could call it Prairie Star Cooperative, maybe. Everyone who joins agrees. We pool some of our wheat. We negotiate one price. We share the profit. Grace's eyes shone. We get a star? Ethan smiled. Maybe on a sign. That Sunday, the town gathered at the small white church. The building was simple. Wooden pews, plain glass windows, a modest steeple, set on a little rise overlooking the town. After the service, people spilled out into the yard, talking in clusters. Men in worn suits, women in faded dresses and Sunday hats, children chasing each other around the hitching posts. The pastor, Reverend Collins, stood near the door, shaking hands. He was a slender man in his 40s with thinning, sandy hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a kind, lined face. His sermons were more about holding each other up than fire and brimstone, and he had a quiet way of listening that made people tell him things they hadn't planned to share. Jacob, he said when Ethan approached with Caleb and Mary. Good to see you up and about. Heard your field's been causing talk. Good talk, I hope, Ethan said. Depends who you ask, Collins replied, eyes twinkling. Harold Jenkins muttered something about witchcraft in the furrows. I told him, if the Lord wanted to bless your harvest a little extra, we shouldn't complain. Lily was nearby, talking to a group of women. She wore a pale blue dress and a simple straw hat, a school book tucked under one arm as if she were never entirely off duty. When she saw Ethan, she excused herself and crossed the grass, skirts brushing the tops of the wildflowers along the path. "You look like a man with an idea," she said quietly. "I have too many," he admitted. "I need help turning one of them into words country folk will actually listen to." Her brows rose, interested. "What sort of idea?" "About not going broke," he said. "Together." A few hours later, they had their chance. At the back of the church was a low-ceilinged room used for suppers and meetings. Today, it held long tables and the smells of potluck dishes, casseroles, pies, stews. As people finished eating, Reverend Collins, at Ethan's request, tapped his spoon against a glass. "Folks," Collins said, his voice carrying without needing to shout, "young Jacob Miller has something he'd like to share. I've told him this is as good a place as any to talk sense, if he's got some to offer." Heads turned. Jenkins folded his arms. Tommy lounged against the wall, hat tipped back, expression curious and skeptical all at once. A woman Ethan hadn't met before, Martha Ainsley, a tall, thin widow with a stern mouth, dark dress, and the permanently tired eyes of someone raising 3 children alone, watched from near the door, her youngest tugging at her skirt. Ethan swallowed. Public speaking had never bothered him in conference rooms full of sharp suits. But this was different. These people didn't care about his degrees or his titles. They cared whether they'd have food next winter. Lily slipped him a reassuring glance and moved to the side of the room where a small chalkboard leaned against the wall. She lifted it onto a crate, chalk in hand, ready. Ethan stepped forward. "Most of you know me as Jacob," he began. "I know I've seemed different since that fall. Maybe hitting my head knocked loose some things I'd been thinking and never said." A few chuckles broke the tension. "I'm not here to brag about the backfield," he went on. "You've heard enough about that. I'm here because I don't think more grain on one farm will save any of us if we keep selling it the same way." He nodded toward the window, where the faint outline of the Harrington elevator could be seen on the horizon. "Right now, each of us hauls our wheat there. Harrington tells us the price. We take it or we haul the load back home, and most of us can't afford to do that. We're small, alone, easy to squeeze." Lily, on cue, drew a row of little stick figures with sacks of grain under them, arrows pointing to a big square labeled Harrington. "What if we weren't small?" Ethan said. "What if, for once, we acted like we believed we're neighbors instead of rivals? What if 20 farms went to the buyer as one? One big pile of grain, one voice." He motioned, and Lily drew the same stick figures, but now their arrows merged into a large sack labeled Prairie Star, with a single arrow pointing toward a buyer. "We call it a cooperative," Ethan said. "Prairie Star Cooperative. Each of you who joins brings in an agreed amount of wheat. We sell it together through one deal. We get a better price because it's a bigger load. We keep enough to pay our debts, and the rest, after costs, is shared out based on what you brought in." Jenkins snorted. "And who holds all that grain while you go hunting for better prices?" "You. What happens if your co-op goes bust? We lose everything at once instead of one by one." "That's a fair fear," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to hand me your farms. We'd start small, a portion of your crop, not all. Enough to make a difference, not enough to sink you if I'm wrong. The account books would be open. Lily here would keep them. She's better with numbers than I am some days." Lily blinked at being pulled in so plainly, then lifted her chin. "I already keep the school's ledgers," she said. "I can keep one more." Martha Ainsley spoke up, voice thin but steady. "And this isn't charity?" she asked. "I don't like the taste of handouts, never have." "No," Ethan said. "This is business. You put in, you get back. No one gets more than their share, including me." Tommy's voice floated from the back. "And what if Harrington hears we're banding together and just cuts his price further, or refuses to buy from anyone in your club?" "Then we go to someone else," Ethan said. "There's Mason's mill. He's bought from us before. Not much because it's not worth his time to deal with tiny loads. But if Prairie Star can promise him a wagon train full at once, that's different." He didn't mention that, in his world, he'd seen entire corporations bend when suppliers finally learned to act together. He didn't mention the word monopsony or labor union. The principles were old, even if the language was not. Silence spun out. People shifted, glanced at one another, weighing pride against hunger, fear against the faint buzz of possibility. Reverend Collins cleared his throat. "I can't tell any man what to do with his harvest," he said. "But I can say this. The good book speaks often of sharing burdens. Sometimes that means more than dropping off a casserole. Sometimes it means admitting you can't lift a load alone." Jenkins shook his head, muttering, but he didn't walk out. It was Martha Ainsley who stepped forward first. She was taller up close than she'd seemed across the room, her hands calloused, her black dress patched at the elbows. The death of her husband in a threshing accident 2 years earlier had hardened her, but not turned her bitter. She bent, but did not break. "If I can get a better price for enough wheat to keep my children in shoes next winter," she said, "I'll sign." She met Ethan's gaze steadily. "But if you cheat us, Miller, I'll be the first to come knocking." "That's fair," Ethan said. One by one, more farmers came forward. A lanky man with a nervous laugh who introduced himself as Peter Crowley, his hair sticking up as if permanently surprised. A round-faced couple, the Lopezes, recent arrivals from Texas with warm smiles and cautious English. Jenkins stayed put, arms folded, but his wife nudged him hard enough that he grunted something that might have been, "We'll see," later. Lily wrote names carefully on a sheet of paper, each signature or shaky X a tiny act of faith. When they were done, there were 9 families on the list. Not the whole town, not even half, but enough to matter. Outside, under a sky streaked with the fading colors of late afternoon, Ethan stood with Lily by the hitching posts while people hitched horses and loaded children into wagons. "You did well," she said quietly. "They signed on to a promise and a picture," he replied. "No grains moved yet." "Every change starts with a story someone believes," she said. "You gave them one." He looked at the sheet in his hand, at the uneven lines and ink blots. Prairie Star Cooperative. 9 names, 9 chances to fail, 9 chances to prove something new. From up the street, a figure watched from the steps of the general store. It was the thin clerk from Harrington's yard, hat off now, hair damp with sweat. Mr. Duffy, a man in his 30s with a narrow face and quick eyes, the kind of underling who heard everything and chose carefully what to repeat to his boss. He took in the cluster at the church hall door. the farmer's lingering with Jacob Miller, and his mouth tightened just a fraction before he turned away. Ethan didn't see him. He was busy imagining wagons lined up not at Harrington's elevator, but at some other buyer's yard, one big sale instead of dozens of desperate ones. Prairie Star was no more than ink on paper and murmured assent, for now. But as the last wagon rolled away and dust settled back onto the road, Ethan felt the first faint tremor of something shifting beneath the surface of the town's routines. For the first time, we had entered a conversation that had always been me against them. It wasn't a harvest yet, but it was a seed. Chapter 5, Prairie Gold on Paper. Prairie Star started as ink and hope, and for a while, that's all it was. After the meeting at the church, the 9 families who had signed their names went back to their fields, their barns, their worn kitchen tables. Life did not pause for new ideas. Cows still needed milking, fences still needed mending, and bills still needed paying. But the thought was there now, like a stone in a shoe. Every time a man hitched his wagon to haul grain to Harrington, he felt it. The quiet, nagging question of whether there might be another way. For Ethan, there was no nagging. There was only urgency. A few days after the church meeting, he stood in the Miller yard with Lily and Caleb, a rough sketch of the farm and the surrounding property spread over an upturned crate. The map was just pencil lines on paper. Fields, roads, the distant town, but it gave shape to what he'd been turning over in his mind. We can't act like a co-op if we don't have somewhere to put the grain, he said. Right now, everyone's still hauling straight to Harrington because they don't have room to hold on to it. Caleb scratched his chin. We got our own bins. Lopez has a little storage. Jenkins, too. Why not just fill those first? Because the whole point is to show up with one big load, Ethan said. If grain is scattered in a dozen little sheds, it's harder to keep track, harder to bargain. We need a place that says Prairie Star when you look at it. And you want that place to be here? Lily asked, tracing the circle he'd drawn near the edge of town. Close to the road and close to the tracks, Ethan said. But land there's dear. I don't think the bank will loan us enough yet to build some big fancy grain elevator. We start smaller. A long shed, raised off the ground, good airflow. Wooden bins inside. Better than the average barn, not as grand as Harrington's tower. Caleb gave a low whistle. That's still a lot of lumber and nails. I know, Ethan replied, which is why I need to talk to Whitaker again. Only this time, not as one farmer with a hat in his hands, but as someone speaking for 9. Lily glanced at the paper, then at Ethan. If you're going to ask for money in the name of Prairie Star, you should at least look like Prairie Star is real, she said. A name, a symbol, something people can see. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. They spent that afternoon at the miller's kitchen table. While Mary baked bread and Grace hummed to herself at the hearth, Ethan and Lily filled a scrap of butcher paper with sketches. Lily drew stars and sheaves of wheat, suns rising over lines that might be fields. Ethan, who could design a Monte Carlo simulation but not a decent circle, mostly criticized his own attempts and tried again. What about this? Lily said at last, holding up a drawing, a stylized sun breaking over 3 simple lines of land, a single 5-pointed star just above the curve. It was clean, bold enough to be recognized at a distance. Ethan stared at it and saw labels on sacks, a board on a barn, a stencil on the side of a wagon. "That's it," he said. "Prairie Star. But I want something for the grain, too. A name that sounds like what we're selling." Lily tapped her chin with the charcoal. "The town is nothing but prairie and wheat. What do you call wheat when it's good?" "Gold," Ethan said immediately. He'd heard the phrase his whole life in another timeline. Amber waves of grain. Prairie Gold. Lily wrote the words under the sun. Prairie Gold. Letters neat and firm. Grace leaned over, eyes wide. "Looks like it belongs on something fancy in the general store," she said. "That's the idea," Ethan told her. 2 days later, he walked back into Prairie Bank and Trust, carrying that same sketch and a folded list of names. The bank's tiled floor and polished brass gleamed in the late morning light. Simon Reed looked up from the front counter, his freckled face brightening with recognition. "Morning, Jacob," Simon said. "You here to see Mr. Whitaker again?" "If he'll have me," Ethan replied. Simon disappeared through the frosted glass door. Moments later, Henry Whitaker himself appeared, vest buttoned, mustache freshly combed. "Twice in as many weeks," Whitaker said. "Farm must be in more trouble than I thought." "Or in better shape than you did," Ethan answered lightly. "If you'll give me a moment, sir." Back in the manager's office, Ethan laid out the list of 9 cooperative members and the sketch of the Prairie Star symbol. Whitaker adjusted his spectacles and studied them in silence. "You're forming some sort of association," he said at last. "A cooperative," Ethan said. "We're combining part of our harvest to sell together. But to do that right, we need storage. I'm not asking for a fortune, just enough to buy timber and hardware for a proper shed and bins." Whitaker's eyes flicked to the names on the list. Ainsley, Crowley, Lopez, Miller, Brown, and others. "These people understand they're tying their fortunes together?" "They understand they're already tied together, whether they admit it or not," Ethan said. "If one or two fail, the rest get squeezed harder. This way, at least they're pulling in the same direction." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the blotter. "You ask as Jacob Miller or as Prairie Star?" "As Prairie Star," Ethan said. "We'd like the loan in that name. That way, it's not just my family on the hook if things go sideways." "A bold request," Whitaker murmured. "You realize if the co-op defaults, I have to go after multiple farms instead of one." "And if it succeeds," Ethan countered, "you have 9 accounts more likely to pay on time, perhaps even early." For a moment, Whitaker's face softened, as if he were remembering another young man with impossible plans. Then the line said again. "I can authorize a modest loan," he said. "Enough for lumber and basic construction. No more. You will keep clear records, and I will want to see them. Miss Hart, as your bookkeeper, may reassure some, but not me. She'll be relieved to know you're not easily impressed," Ethan said dryly. A corner of Whitaker's mouth twitched. He signed a document, sanded it, and slid it across the desk. "Prairie Star Cooperative," he said. "Let us see if that name means anything a year from now." Building meant work, and work was something the farmers understood. On a warm Saturday, the 9 families gathered on a flat piece of land near the miller's fence line, close enough to the road that wagons could reach it, and far enough from the house that Mary didn't have to worry about dust choking her laundry. Piles of cut timber lay in the yard, and the smell of fresh wood mixing with the earthy scent of trampled grass. Samuel Carter was there, sleeves rolled up, an old measuring tape draped around his neck. Elias Turner stood beside him, arms crossed, eyeing the plans Lily held. Simple lines drawn with the same neat hand that had sketched the Prairie Star symbol. "It won't be pretty," Elias said, "but it'll stand if we brace it right." "It doesn't have to be pretty," Martha Ainsley replied, her hair tied back in a scarf as she hoisted a beam with surprising strength. "Just has to keep the weevils and rain out." The Lopez children ran around carrying smaller pieces of lumber, their dark hair and the quick smiles flashing in the sunlight. Peter Crowley provided a lopsided commentary on everything, cracking jokes whenever someone grunted too loudly under a heavy load. Even Jenkins showed up, claiming he was there only to make sure you don't build something that falls on my side of the fence. But his hands ended up as blistered as anyone's by midday. Tommy Brown, lanky and restless, swung a hammer with an ease that came from helping his father build sheds since he was big enough to lift tools. He wore his hat tilted back, eyes squinting against the sun, shirt sticking to his back. There was a new watch on his wrist, cheap but shiny, which he checked now and then as if listening for a ticking future. "Where'd you get that?" Ethan asked during a break, nodding at the watch. Tommy shrugged. "Mr. Harrington's man needed extra help at the elevator. Paid me for a few days' work." His tone was casual, but there was a flicker of defensiveness behind his grin. "Don't look at me like that. Money's money." "I'm not judging," Ethan said. "Just be careful what stories you carry back and forth." Tommy's jaw tightened. "I'm not anybody's spy, Jacob. I just stack sacks where I'm told." Ethan let it drop, for now. By late afternoon, the frame of the shed stood, long and low, raised off the ground on stout posts. Inside, partition walls hinted at future grain bins. The roof would have to wait for another day, when shoulders weren't screaming and hands weren't raw. Not bad for a bunch of folks who usually only build fences and coffins, Peter Crowley said, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Lily, who had brought a jug of lemonade and bandages for blisters, stood back and looked at the structure, then at Ethan. "You realize what you've done?" she said. "Made everyone too tired to argue," he guessed. "Given them something they built together," she said. "That's harder to walk away from than a name on a piece of paper." A few days later, a man in a dusty suit stepped off the afternoon train. He was in his mid-30s, not tall but solidly built, with light brown hair parted neatly to one side and a trimmed beard that could not quite hide his road-weary expression. His suit had seen better days, but it had been cut by a good tailor once, and the shoes, though scuffed, were sturdy. This was Edward Mason, traveling buyer for Mason Brothers Milling Company in the city. His eyes were a sharp gray blue, scanning the town with a practiced efficiency born from years of calculating how many bushels he could secure before the next train. He carried a leather satchel and a clipboard, the tools of his trade. Ethan met him not at Harrington's elevator, where buyers usually gravitated, but at the diner on Main Street. The diner was a narrow building with a long counter, a few tables, and the smell of coffee and fried potatoes lingering in the air. The owner, Mrs. Green, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense bun of gray hair, kept the place tidy and her customers in line with equal firmness. "Coffee?" she asked Mason as he sat. "Please," he said, voice smooth but tired. When she moved off, Ethan slid onto the stool beside him. "Mr. Mason?" Mason glanced over, brow furrowing. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Name's Jacob Miller. I hear you buy grain for a mill that isn't Harrington's." Mason's mouth twitched. "That I do, when there's enough of it in one place to be worth my time." "That's why I'm here," Ethan said. He laid the Prairie Star sketch and the list of 9 names on the counter between them. "We're putting our wheat together this year. Not all of it, but enough. Prairie Star Cooperative. If we can promise you a certain number of bushels at harvest, all delivered in one lot, would you pay a cent or two more a bushel than Harrington?" Mason sipped his coffee, eyes on the paper. He was not a cruel man, nor particularly sentimental. His mornings were made of margins and his nights of ledgers. But he respected clear thinking, and what he saw here, a group of farmers trying to act like a single supplier, piqued his interest. "How many bushels are we talking?" he asked. Ethan named a number that made Mason's eyebrows climb, but not so high they disappeared into his hair. "If weather doesn't betray us," Ethan added, "and you'd have this stored where?" Ethan nodded toward the half-finished shed visible through the diner window, its frame stark against the sky. "There, we're finishing it in the next week or 2. Mason thought for a long moment, weighing costs and risks, imagining his own boss's faces if he could announce a new steady source of quality wheat. "If you bring me that amount, dry and clean, before the first frost," he said slowly, "I can offer you 1.5 cents more per bushel than Harrington's posted price. No promises beyond this season." 1.5 cents, Ethan repeated. It didn't sound like much, but spread across thousands of bushels, it was the difference between barely surviving and breathing room. "We can work with that." Mason extended his hand. "Then we have an understanding, Mr. Miller. Bring me the grain, and I'll bring the money." They shook on it. No contracts, no lawyers, just calloused fingers and a shared acceptance that reputations mattered more than signatures out here. That evening, Ethan stood with Mary and Caleb at the edge of the yard, looking at the skeletal shape of the co-op shed. The sky above was streaked with pink and gold, the air cooling as the sun slipped behind the endless line of fields. "Looks a bit like a church without walls," Mary said softly. "Maybe it is," Ethan replied. "A place where we worship the only thing we can all agree on. No one wants to go hungry." Caleb grunted, but there was a hint of a smile in his beard. "You got your shed. You got your buyer. Now all you need is for the weather to behave and the men to keep their word." "And for the numbers to add up," Ethan said. Those, at least, were something he understood. The shed was still rough wood and empty air, Prairie Gold still just a name on a scrap of paper. But the shape of the future was there, a place to gather grain, a buyer willing to pay more, a group of families who, for the first time, were willing to say ours instead of mine when they looked at their harvest. It was a fragile start, but it was real. Chapter 6. Rates and Lines. By midsummer, the Prairie Star shed no longer looked like a skeleton. The roof was on, the walls were boarded tight, and the big sliding doors hung straight on their iron runners. Inside, rows of wooden bins stood waiting, each marked with a chalked number. The Prairie Star symbol, Lily's sun and star over 3 lines of land, was painted in clean black on the front gable, visible from the road like a quiet challenge to Harrington's towering grain elevator on the other side of town. On most days, someone was there. Samuel checking the supports and sweeping out stray debris, Martha Ainsley with a basket of food for whoever was working, Peter Crowley measuring and remeasuring the space and joking about how they'd better fill the thing or it'll start feeling lonely. Every time Ethan passed the shed, his chest tightened with a mix of pride and fear. It was real now. Real things could fall down. He was in the yard one hot afternoon, going over a rough schedule for when each family would bring their first loads in, when Tommy's wagon tore into the Miller Drive like the horse had been spooked. Dust billowed up behind it. Tommy jumped down before the wheels had fully stopped, hat askew, sweat streaking the dust on his face. "Jacob," he called, breathless, "you seen the notice at the depot?" Ethan straightened, heart ticking up. "What notice?" Tommy shoved a crumpled sheet of paper at him. It was a copy of a rate chart, the railroad's logo at the top. Someone had underlined a new line in heavy ink, an extra handling fee for grain shipped from non-affiliated private storage facilities on their spur line, facilities like Prairie Star. Beside that, in smaller print, a note that Harrington Grain shipments qualified for a preferred partner discount for the season. "It went up 1.50 a bushel for us," Tommy said, voice sharp with anger that wasn't entirely for Ethan's sake. "And down 1 cent for Harrington. Duffy posted it on the board at the elevator like he was hanging a trophy." Ethan stared at the numbers. The extra freight would eat up most of what Mason had promised them above Harrington's price. It wouldn't kill Prairie Star outright, but it would make the co-op look foolish, his promises hollow. "Who signed off on this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Briggs at the depot said it came from the district office in Topeka," Tommy said. He kept saying, "Just following company policy, like that makes it taste better." Tommy's jaw was clenched, his easy grin nowhere to be seen. The shiny watch on his wrist looked out of place now, a reminder of which yard he'd been working in when he heard first. "You tell anyone you were coming to see me?" Ethan asked quietly. Tommy shook his head. "I ain't stupid. But listen, if Harrington can make the railroad dance like that once, he can do it again. You sure you want to keep poking that bear?" "We're already in the ring," Ethan said. "There's no stepping out without getting mauled." Later that day, Ethan hitched Duke and headed into town, the sun a white weight in the sky. At the depot, the air inside smelled of ink, dust, and hot metal. A ceiling fan spun lazily, stirring the heavy air more than cooling it. Behind the counter, Albert Briggs sorted papers into neat stacks. Briggs was a thin man in his 40s with a receding hairline, hair slicked back with too much pomade. His round glasses sat low on his nose, and his narrow shoulders hunched as if afraid of taking up too much space. He lived by schedules and forms, the kind of man who believed chaos could be kept at bay if every box was checked twice. "Afternoon, Jacob," Briggs said, looking up. "You here to book a shipment?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "I'm here about this." He slid the rate sheet across the counter. "When did these changes go into effect?" "Today," Briggs replied. "District office sent the telegram this morning. New policy." "New policy that just happens to penalize anyone not named Harrington," Ethan said. Briggs winced. "Now, Jacob, it's not my doing. Grain volume through Harrington's elevator is substantial, and the company sometimes offers volume discounts. That's normal business." "And charging extra for using your own spur line if the grain doesn't go through Harrington?" Ethan pressed. "Is that normal too?" Briggs fiddled with his pen. The railroad has to protect its infrastructure. Private facilities can be less reliable. Spoilage, delays, disputes over loading. The fee covers that risk. Ethan thought of the sturdy frame of the Prairie Star shed, the way Samuel checked every joint twice. Our shed will be as sound as Harrington's, maybe more. You know that. Briggs looked pained. Jacob, I don't make the rules. If you have a complaint, you can talk to the district superintendent when he comes through on Thursday, Mr. Pierce. But I warn you, he's a busy man. Busy doesn't mean deaf, Ethan said. Put my name down. I'll be here. Back at the farm, he found Samuel in the co-op shed, measuring the gaps between slats where sunlight fingered through. Sam's shirt was damp with sweat, his hands moving with that same careful precision Ethan had first noticed in the stables. "You hear about the freight rates?" Ethan asked. Samuel nodded. "Word travels faster than trains when they steal from folks." Ethan walked the length of the shed, trailing his fingers along the smooth boards. "We can't eat that whole fee, not and keep our promise to Mason and the co-op members." "So don't," Sam said. "Make the railroad eat some of it instead." Ethan huffed a humorless laugh. "You make it sound simple." Sam shrugged, a faint smile touching his lips. "I've seen enough rich men come through Harrington's yard to know two things. They don't like losing coin, and they don't like losing face. You find a way to make this cost them both, they might start listening." That evening, the co-op members gathered inside the shed for the first official meeting among its walls. The interior smelled of wood and dust, echoing slightly as voices bounced off still empty bins. Lily stood near a makeshift table of planks on sawhorses, ledger open, a pencil tucked behind her ear. The farmers were already riled. Jenkins paced with his hat clenched in one hand, muttering about railroad thieves. Martha sat straight-backed on a crate, lips pressed thin. The Lopezes huddled together, listening intently. Tommy leaned against a post, arms folded, eyes shadowed. Ethan raised his voice just enough to cut through the low rumble. "The railroad fee is a punch we didn't see coming," he said, "but it doesn't break us yet. I'm meeting the district superintendent Thursday. I'll argue our case." "And if he doesn't care?" Jenkins demanded. "If he's already in Harrington's pocket like the rest?" "Then we look at hauling to the next town station," Ethan said. "It's farther, but if we go as a caravan, we can share costs. I won't lie to you, it'll hurt, but it's better than crawling back to Harrington on our knees." A murmur ran through the room at that. Pride and fear tangled in the air. "We'll need someone watching this place when we're hauling," Martha said, "taking in grain, weighing, marking who brought what. Someone who can keep track when half the rest of us are away." Eyes turned to Ethan, then to Lily. She lifted her hands. "I can keep the books, but I can't lift sacks or run down a child crawling where they shouldn't," she said. "We need someone who knows grain, knows wagons, and can shout loud enough to be heard." Ethan glanced at Samuel, who stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed loosely, listening. "Sam's the best we've got at that," Ethan said. "He's worked around grain and horses longer than most of us have been alive. I'd like him to be foreman here when we start loading." A ripple passed through the room. Most faces showed simple consideration. A few tightened. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "Harrington's stable hand?" Jenkins said. "You want the man who keeps Harrington's horses to keep our grain?" Sam's gaze stayed steady, but his jaw flexed. He'd heard worse, and from men who called him worse than stable hand. He keeps the horses from collapsing under overfilled loads, Ethan said. He's patched more broken wagons than anyone I know, and he's got no reason to love Harrington more than any of us. Martha's voice cut in, cool and clear. I've watched Samuel work, she said. He takes better care of another man's animals than some take of their own children. I'd trust him with a bin of wheat. The Lopezes nodded vigorously. Peter Crowley shrugged. If he can yell at me to move faster while I'm hauling, he's the right man for the job, he said, grinning, trying to lighten the air. Jenkins looked like he wanted to say more, but under the combined weight of Martha's stare and Grace's wide-eyed, hopeful look from beside Mary, he finally grunted. Fine, but if a single sack goes missing, it'll be because you miscounted, Sam said mildly. A few chuckles eased the tension. They voted, informal but clear. Samuel Carter became the first foreman of Prairie Star's shed. For him, it was more than a job. It was a small, quiet victory over a lifetime of being told he could work the edges but never sit at the center. Thursday came hot and windless, dust hanging in the air like a veil. Ethan arrived at the depot early, shirt clean, hair combed, carrying a folded summary of projected shipments like a talisman. Briggs fussed with papers behind the counter until the noon train pulled in with a shriek of brakes and a hiss of steam. From the second passenger car descended Walter Pierce, district superintendent. Pierce was a broad man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a stomach that strained against his vest. His suit was dark and well-pressed, and he carried himself with the slight sway of someone accustomed to moving between offices and parlors, not fields. His eyes were a washed-out blue, alert but tired, the eyes of a man who had seen too many complaints and too few thanks. Mr. Pierce, Briggs said nervously, hurrying forward. This is Jacob Miller. He asked to speak with you about the new grain rates. Pierce gave Ethan a once-over, taking in the calloused hands and earnest set of his jaw. You've got 5 minutes, Mr. Miller, he said. Make good use of them. In the depot office, with the map of the rail district on the wall and the telegraph ticking softly, Ethan laid out his case. He spoke not as a boy begging for mercy, but as someone who understood flow, of grain, of money, of risk. If Prairie Star fails, he said, tapping the map where his town lay, 9 farms go down easier, maybe more, when the neighbors who stayed out of it find themselves squeezed harder. That's 9 fewer sets of wagons hauling to your line next year. Maybe the year after that, too. You gain extra freight in the short term by making it harder on us, but you lose volume when we can't afford to plant. Pierce's mouth thinned. You're not the only farmers on this line. No, Ethan said, but we're the ones trying to make sure we stay farmers and not tenants on someone else's land. If you keep rates fair between Harrington and Prairie Star, you get 2 healthy shippers instead of 1 bloated one. And if Harrington ever stumbles, you don't find yourself with all your eggs in his basket. Pierce studied him, weighing the argument like a load on a scale. You speak like a man who's read more than seed catalogs. I've read what happens when too many people bet on one big name, Ethan said. It doesn't end well for the little ones, or the ones in charge of the rails beneath them. A hint of something, caution, or maybe recognition, flickered in Pierce's eyes. He drummed his fingers on the desk. I can't undo the entire rate structure, he said slowly. The discount for Harrington stays. He moves a great deal of grain, and the company values that. Ethan's stomach tightened. But, Pierce went on, I can remove the extra handling fee for shipments from your co-op shed for the rest of this season. Consider it a pilot. If there are delays, spoilage, or disputes, the fee returns next year, perhaps higher. If everything runs smoothly and volume is as you claim, we may revisit the matter. It wasn't as much as Ethan had hoped for. It was more than he'd feared. Thank you, sir, he said. You won't regret it. Pierce grunted. I regret most things eventually, he said, not unkindly, but I'd regret idle tracks more. That evening, in the half-shadowed interior of the Prairie Star shed, Ethan shared the news. The extra fee was gone, for now. Harrington still had his discount, but the gap had closed enough that Mason's higher price meant something again. So, we still have to run faster just to keep up with a man on a horse, Peter Crowley said, but at least they didn't tie our legs together. Exactly, Ethan said. Lily wrote the new numbers into the ledger, her neat handwriting turning air and argument into ink and fact. Samuel fixed a crooked board near the door with a few sure strikes of his hammer, as if to mark the moment. Outside, the rails gleamed in the last light, thin lines connecting their small town to cities Ethan had once walked as another man. Somewhere down those lines, Mason's mill waited, reluctantly tethered to the same steel as Harrington's elevator. The game had tilted against them, then shifted back a fraction. Prairie Star had survived its first real counterpunch. The harvest and all the risks it carried still lay ahead. But for now, the path Ethan had drawn in his mind, field to shed, shed to rail, rail to a buyer who wasn't Harrington, was still intact, and that was enough to keep hope moving forward, one car at a time. Chapter 7, Drought Math. The first sign was the way the wind changed. It blew hotter and drier, rolling across the Kansas plains like a breath from an oven, taking more moisture than it brought. Clouds thinned and vanished. Rain that should have fallen in soft, soaking sheets came as brief, teasing spit or not at all. By late June, the wheat in the fields had lost that lush, deep green of early growth and taken on a strained, grayish cast. Ethan walked the rows every morning and evening, fingers brushing brittle leaves. The soil crumbled to dust when he pressed it between thumb and forefinger. He could feel the land flinching. He had seen charts in his old life, lines on screens showing rainfall anomalies in places like this a century ago. But knowing how a story ended in theory and watching it unfold in front of you were two different things. At the Miller kitchen table, newspapers lay folded open. Where most people glanced at headlines about politics or society, Ethan's eyes went to the small print from Chicago. Grain market reports. In recent days, the numbers had begun to twitch upward. Wheat, futures ticking higher cent by cent. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other farmers in other states were looking up at the same empty sky. The price is going up, Lily said one evening, leaning over his shoulder to read. Her hair smelled faintly of chalk dust and soap, stray strands fallen from her braid after a long day teaching. On paper, Ethan said, in the contracts in Chicago. Right now, the wheat in the ground is worth more than it was a month ago. He tapped the page. Question is, how much of it will actually make it to a sack? They called a Prairie Star meeting the next day in the shed. The air inside was hot and still, the wooden walls holding in the day's warmth. A few flies buzzed lazily against the windows. Men wiped sweat from their necks with bandanas, shirts darkened at the back. Martha Ainsley fanned herself with a folded newspaper. The Lopez children lay on their stomachs near the door, drawn in the dust. Ethan stood near the makeshift table. On it lay the Chicago report, a pencil and a scrap of paper already covered in small, neat columns. "You all know it hasn't rained enough," he began. "You can feel it in your fields. When rain is short, wheat suffers. But the market in the city doesn't see our fields. It sees numbers. It sees less wheat coming and starts paying more for whatever will arrive." "Good for them," Jenkins grumbled. "Doesn't help when your stocks turn to straw." "It helps if we make it help," Ethan said. He picked up the newsprint and held it up. "Right now, buyers in Chicago are paying more on contracts for wheat to be delivered later this year. We can lock in some of that higher price now before the drought gets worse, or before it breaks and prices fall again." Peter Crowley scratched his head, hair sticking up more than usual. "You're talking about those suturies?" "Futures," Ethan corrected. "Think of it this way. We promise, on paper, to sell a certain amount of wheat at today's higher price when harvest comes. If the price goes higher later, we miss out on some extra. If the price crashes because everyone's fields recover at once, we're protected. More important," he looked at Jenkins, "if we lose some of our crop to this dryness, those contracts can cover part of what the sun took." "You're gambling," Jenkins said. "I'm managing risk," Ethan replied. "Harrington gambles. He bets on low prices and big harvests so he can make more on the spread. I want to do the opposite. Sell a slice of our future harvest at a price that keeps us alive, no matter which way the weather jumps." Lily stepped forward, taking a piece of chalk to the board they'd leaned against a post. "Jacob explained it to me like this," she said, drawing two simple lines. "If harvest is good, we might have more wheat than we promised, and we sell the extra at whatever the market is then. If harvest is bad, at least we have the promise, the contract money, to soften the blow." Martha's eyes narrowed. "And how do we little folks sign these fancy papers in Chicago?" "We don't," Ethan said. "Mason does. He already deals with the board. If we agree on a fixed price with him now for part of our crop, he can hedge his side in the city. He carries some risk, we carry some, but we both know where the floor is." Silence sat in the warm air for a moment, heavy and thoughtful. "How much is part?" asked Mr. Lopez, his accent soft but his gaze sharp. "Not everything," Ethan said. "We don't want to be forced to deliver what we don't have. A fraction of what we reasonably expect, even with the drought. Enough that if the worst happens, the money from those contracts, plus the little we harvest, keeps us from losing our farms." Jenkins chewed his lip. "Feels wrong, promising wheat that ain't grown yet." "Every time you plant a seed, you promise yourself a harvest that hasn't grown yet," Lily said quietly. "This just puts numbers to it." In the end, they agreed. Cautious, grudging, but committed. Ethan wrote a careful letter to Edward Mason, spelling out the quantity and the price they were asking for as a forward contract. A week later, a reply came by post, Mason's neat handwriting confirming the deal. Prairie Star would deliver that amount at the agreed price. Mason would handle his own protections in Chicago. Then all they could do was work and wait and watch the sky refuse to change. By late July, the drought was no longer something they muttered about over supper. It was a presence. Cows bawled more often, licking dry troughs. Wells needed checking more frequently. The wheat stalks rattled in the wind like bones. One afternoon, as Ethan and Caleb walked the edge of their field, sweat trickling down their backs, they passed Jenkins' place. The older man stood in his own field, hat in his hands, looking at his crop as if he'd forgotten why he'd planted it. His shoulders sagged in a way Ethan had never seen. "Looks worse every day," Jenkins muttered when they drew near. "Half my heads are thin, other half are empty." He glanced sideways. "You think your paper tricks will make up for this?" "They won't make it rain," Ethan said, "but they might make the bank blink before they take your house." Jenkins snorted. "I didn't sign for Prairie Star." "You still can," Ethan said. "We can fold some of your grain into the contract amount if we watch the numbers." Pride wrestled with fear in Jenkins' eyes. He swallowed. "I'll think on it," he said, which from him was as good as maybe. The days blurred into heat and worry. When rain finally came, it was late and brief. A gray curtain swept across the prairie by a sudden wind. The drops hit the hard ground and ran off more than they soaked in. It kept the crop from dying outright, but not from shrinking. Harvest felt different that year. The air was still hot, but there was no hum of abundance, only the steady scratch of scythes and the clack of machines biting into fields that yielded less than they should. In the Prairie Star shed, Samuel weighed each wagon load with extra care, his hands moving over the scales beam like a musician tuning an instrument. Lily recorded numbers in the ledger, her brow furrowed, lips pressed tight. "Is it enough?" Grace asked Ethan in a whisper as she watched the growing, but not huge, pile in one of the bins. "It has to be," he said, though his stomach twisted. When Mason arrived, he came straight to the shed. Dust coated his suit, and his collar was loosened, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He walked the bins, fingers trailing over the grain, checking for moisture, for spoilage. "You came close," he said finally, looking at the ledger Lily handed him. "Closer than some I've seen this week." "Is it enough to meet the contract?" Ethan asked. "Just," Mason replied. "You'll have very little left over to sell at the higher spot price, but you'll get what we agreed on for this amount." He tapped the page. "And my positions in Chicago more than cover my side." On the day he paid them, men and women lined up in the shed, hats off, faces lined by sun and worry. Mason wrote checks with his brass fountain pen, each slip of paper a small, heavy miracle. Martha's hands shook when she took hers. The Lopezes smiled, eyes bright with mixed relief and exhaustion. Even Jenkins, who had grudgingly joined the co-op late and folded part of his crop into the contract, swallowed hard before stuffing his check into his pocket as if afraid it would vanish. Ethan watched the line and felt something unclench in his chest. The yield had been poor, but the drought had driven prices so high that, with the contract money, most of Prairie Star's families would make their interest payments. They would live to plant again. Outside of Prairie Star, it was a different story. One morning, Tommy found Ethan at the shed, face pale beneath the dust. "You need to come see this," he said, "at Harrington's." They rode into town together. The yard around Harrington Grain's elevator, usually a scene of orderly bustle, was a knot of wagons and angry voices. Farmers clustered near the office door, fists pounding, slips of paper waving in the air. The elevator doors were shut. Near the front, Charles Harrington himself stood on the small loading platform, sweat darkening his collar despite his light suit. His hat sat askew, and his mustache looked less precise than usual. Beside him, his clerk Duffy tried to calm the crowd, his narrow face even pincher than usual. "I said we're paying in scrip today," Harrington shouted, voice fraying. "You can cash it when the banks clear our accounts." "I can't feed my family on a promise," one farmer yelled back, a heavy-set man with red cheeks and a fraying vest. "You told us to wait, that prices would drop and you'd make it right. Now, prices shot up and you're broke?" Rumor ran ahead of fact, as it always did, but the bones of the story were clear enough. Harrington had bet on prices falling, had promised buyers down the line cheaper grain than the market now demanded, had likely taken positions in Chicago that assumed abundance. The drought had flipped the table. Where Prairie Star's cautious contracts had pushed them through, Harrington's speculative ones had pulled him under. From the edge of the crowd, Ethan met Duffy's eye. The clerk's look held no triumph, only weary resignation. Later that week, Whitaker called Ethan into his office. The banker looked more tired than usual, lines carved deeper around his mouth. "Harrington's accounts are in disarray," Whitaker said without preamble. "He's overextended. The bank holds notes on his elevator and equipment. If he defaults completely, we'll be stuck trying to sell an empty tower in a town of angry farmers." Ethan sat, pulse quickening. "What are you going to do?" "Ask you a question I never thought I'd ask a miller boy," Whitaker replied. "Can Prairie Star, with some backing from Mason's Mill and perhaps another modest loan, take over Harrington's elevator before it collapses outright?" For a moment, Ethan saw it all at once. The tower that had symbolized Harrington's control now bearing a different symbol. Prairie Star's shed and the elevator working in tandem instead of opposition. Farmers bringing grain to a place where they weren't just clients but owners. "We'd need careful terms," Ethan said slowly. "We can't afford to swallow his debts whole. But if the price is right, if we take the elevator and the rail spur and leave the worst of his losses for others to sort, we can make it work." Whitaker nodded. "Mason is interested. He likes that you kept his contract this season. He has no love for Harrington. The three of us could structure something. The bank would rather see that tower earning coin under new management than rotting." Ethan's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. In his old life, deals like this had been numbers on a screen, rumors in financial papers. Here, it was wood and steel and the futures of people he knew. "I'm willing," he said, "if Prairie Star's members are." A week later, when the papers were signed and the ink was dry, a small group stood in the yard beneath the elevator. The Harrington sign came down with a squeal of nails and a thud of old paint on dirt. In its place, men hoisted a new board, freshly painted. The rising sun and star lily had designed, above the words Prairie Gold Elevator. Sam stood with his arms crossed, a slow smile creasing his face. Martha wiped at her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Jenkins harumphed something like approval. Tommy grinned outright, tipping his hat back to get a better look. Ethan tilted his head, taking in the symbol he'd first seen on a scrap of paper, now 20 feet up in the air. The drought had bitten deep, and the town still bore the marks. But against that brutal sky, Prairie Star now had not just a shed on the edge of a field, but a tower on the tracks. The system that had once worked entirely against them had just yielded one of its pillars. Not as a gift, not as a miracle, but as a result of numbers, nerve, and a willingness to think beyond one field at a time. For the first time, Ethan felt that the path from survival to something more, a true empire, the prairie, built from the ground up, was not just a dream, but a map he could actually follow. Chapter 8. Boots in the fields. 10 years later, the wheat still moved like an ocean under the Kansas sky, but the shoreline had changed. Where there had once been a single tower with Harrington's name on it, now 3 grain elevators rose along the tracks, each bearing the same symbol: a rising sun, a single star, 3 lines of land beneath. Prairie Gold Elevator, Prairie Gold Feed and Flour, Prairie Gold Storage and Transfer. Boxcars on the siding carried the logo too, stenciled in bold black on weathered red paint. Ethan stood on the edge of his home field at sunrise, boots sunk into the damp soil, watching the light creep over the heads of wheat. He was older now, late 30s in Jacob's body, with a broader set to his shoulders and a few pale lines at the corners of his eyes. The sun and the wind had tanned his skin deeper, and the boyish angles of his face had settled into something steadier. When he smiled, it came easier than it had in the glass towers of 2025, and more rarely than it did when he thought no one was looking. Beside him, a boy of 8 squinted into the light, hands on his hips in perfect imitation of his father. Henry Miller was small for his age, wiry as a young sapling, with his mother's hazel eyes and his father's habit of chewing on the inside of his cheek when he was thinking hard. There was a cowlick at the back of his brown hair that never stayed down, no matter how Mary, or now Lily, smoothed it. "How do you know when the wheat is ready?" Henry asked, kicking at a clod of dirt. "You listen," Ethan said. "When the heads are full and dry, they rattle different. And you look." He plucked a head, rubbed it between his fingers, blew away the chaff, then bit a kernel. "Tastes right? Feels right between your teeth?" Henry tried the same and made a face. "Tastes like bread that forgot to be bread." "Good," Ethan said, laughing. "That means it's almost time to turn it into the real thing." Down the road, a wagon rolled past, its sideboards painted with neat lettering: Brown Prairie Haulage. On the seat, reins in hand, sat Tommy Brown, older but still lanky, his shoulders finally filled out from years of loading freight instead of just dreaming about leaving town. His hair was shorter now, kept under better control, but his grin was as lopsided as ever. A stub of pencil hung behind his ear, and a battered ledger sat between him and the brake, proof that he'd learned to count miles and dollars as carefully as Ethan counted bushels and cents. "Mornin', Jacob," Tommy called, using the name the town still knew. "You planning to take the whole Midwest wheat again this year, or can the rest of us have some?" "Only if your wagons don't break down on the way," Ethan shot back. Tommy tapped the side of his wagon. "Built to last, like some people's stubborn ideas." He tipped his hat to Henry. "You take care of your old man, kid. He forgets to sleep when the numbers start dancing." Henry puffed up a little. "Mama says he does that too." Tommy barked a laugh and clucked to his team, rolling on toward town in a cloud of dust. Prairie Creek itself had grown around Prairie Gold like a vine around a trellis. The main street had more buildings now. A small brick hospital with white curtains in the windows, a new brick schoolhouse with a bell tower alongside the old wooden one, and a 2-story library with wide windows and books stacked all the way to the ceiling. On a bronze plaque outside the library, the words Prairie Gold Foundation gleamed in the morning light. Inside the new schoolhouse, Lily Miller stood at the front of a classroom filled with chalkboards and maps. She was in her early 30s now, still slender, but with a certain groundedness in the way she moved. Her hair, a bit darker than it had been, was twisted into a looser knot than the tight braids of her early teaching days, with a few strands escaping to soften her face. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting at ledgers and laughing at children's questions. On the board behind her, in between arithmetic and spelling, sat a column of simple numbers labeled savings, spending, sharing. She'd started teaching practical lessons alongside reading and writing years ago, how to keep a little aside each week, how to understand a receipt, what it meant to owe and to own. Her students, sons and daughters of farmers and railwaymen, answered her questions about crops and coins with the same seriousness. At recess, she stepped outside, watching children chase each other in the yard. Martha Ainsley, now Martha Collins since she'd married Reverend Collins 3 years earlier, sat on a bench nearby, mending a dress with nimble fingers while keeping an eye on her youngest chasing a hoop. Martha looked older but stronger, a woman who knew hunger too well to waste a full year of good harvests on worry alone. "You coming to the board meeting tonight?" Martha asked without looking up. "Wouldn't miss it," Lily said. "Someone has to remind the men that numbers are more than lines on paper." Martha snorted. "You and your husband sound more alike every year." The Prairie Gold Board meetings were held, now in a modest office above the original depot, a space that smelled faintly of wood polish and ink. The walls held maps of rail lines and regions, pins marking elevator locations and co-op towns in other states. Prairie Star had become the seed of a larger network. Small, farmer-owned groups in neighboring counties and beyond, all using the Prairie Gold brand to sell grain together. Around the meeting table sat familiar faces. Samuel Carter, older, with more gray thread in his short hair, wore a collared shirt and a vest now instead of a stable hand's work clothes. The old scars on his arms were still there, but his hands now spent as much time turning pages as lifting sacks. As operations director for Prairie Gold's elevators, he split his days between the yards and the office, carrying his calm authority wherever he went. Henry Whitaker was there too, though not behind a bank desk. Retirement had softened the set of his shoulders, but his eyes were as sharp as ever behind his spectacles. He now sat as a cautious advisor on Prairie Gold's board, the man who had once nearly taken the Miller farm now helping to protect what it had grown into. Edward Mason had made the trip from the city for this meeting, a bit rounder in the face, his beard flecked with white. His suit was better cut these days, the kinds of small changes that came when steady profits replaced anxious speculation. Today, there was another face at the table. Frank Doyle, a reporter from a Chicago financial newspaper. He was in his early 40s, lean, with ink-stained fingers and a notepad that seemed permanently attached to his hand. His dark hair was cut short, and his keen brown eyes moved constantly, taking in every gesture and expression. He wore a suit that had been pressed in the city but was already picking up prairie dust. "So, let me see if I have this right," Frank said, pencil poised. You started as a handful of near-bankrupt farmers pooling their grain to get a better price, and now Prairie Gold handles. What did you say, Mr. Mason?" Mason adjusted his cuff. "Roughly 12% of the wheat moving east from this part of the state," he said. "Some seasons more." Whitaker added, "And delinquency rates among the farmers in the cooperative network are half what they were before." Frank whistled softly. "No wonder they're calling you the Prairie Billionaire in some circles." He turned to Ethan. "How does it feel to be mentioned in the same breath as men like Carnegie and Rockefeller?" Ethan shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Titles like that still sat oddly on his shoulders. "Carnegie builds steel. Rockefeller built oil," he said. "We move food. I don't wake up thinking about billions. I wake up thinking about what happens if the rain misses us, or if a rail line goes down, or if one of our co-ops has a bad year." Frank's pencil scratched. "Still, the valuation people are whispering about, if Prairie Gold were listed on the exchange. The day we belong more to strangers in distant cities than to the people who fill our bins is the day we've lost what made this work." Ethan cut in, more sharply than he'd intended. He took a breath, softened his tone. "We raise capital when we need it, but the farmers keep a controlling stake. That's not negotiable." Sam chuckled quietly. "Told you he doesn't like easy questions," he murmured. Frank smiled, unfazed. "Story's better when there's a man refusing to sell his soul," he said. "Readers eat that up." Later, when the interviews and numbers and talk of expansion plans were done, Ethan slipped away from the office. The sun was low now, turning the wheat fields beyond town into a sea of copper. He walked the familiar path back to the Miller farm, boots scuffing the dust, the sounds of the town fading behind him, hammer on nails, distant laughter from the schoolyard, a train's whistle far down the line. Mary and Caleb sat on the porch when he arrived, the same chairs they'd used when he first woke up in this world, now worn in different places. Caleb's hair had gone mostly white. His hands knotted with age, but his grip was still firm when he clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Mary's eyes shone with a quiet pride that needed no words. "You remember that first letter from the bank?" Caleb said, nodding toward the fields. "Thought we were done for." "I remember," Ethan said. "Now look at you," Mary added. "Whole town eating out of those numbers you keep in your head." "Better than them going hungry," Ethan answered. After supper, when Henry and his little sister, Anna, 6 years old, all wild curls and bright questions, had finally fallen asleep, Ethan and Lily walked out to the edge of the yard. The sky above them was a velvet sweep of stars, clearer than any night he'd ever seen in New York. Lily slipped her hand into his. "Frank's article will probably make you sound like a legend," she said. "The boy who beat the banks and the barons." "Legends don't wake up worrying about whether a co-op 3 towns over miscounted their loads," he said, "or whether Sam's knee will hold up through another harvest, or whether Henry will grow up thinking money is more important than people. That's because legends are written after the hard parts are done," Lily replied. "We're still in the middle of ours." He looked up at the spread of constellations, patterns strangers had traced onto the sky long before trains and banks and futures markets. Somewhere, and possibly far in another direction, there was a world of glass towers and glowing screens where his name had never been more than a line on a payroll. Sometimes, late at night, He still wondered if there was a crack between worlds he might have slipped back through, if he'd made some invisible choice that had closed it without him noticing. But standing there, with Lily's hand in his and the smell of wheat and earth in his lungs, he found he didn't feel the old ache to go back as sharply anymore. "Do you ever miss the idea of somewhere else?" Lily asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. He squeezed her fingers. "Not as much as I'd miss this if I left," he said. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the rustle of the fields, the distant rumble of a train carrying Prairie Gold's harvest east. The man the newspapers were starting to call a billionaire had dust on his boots and calluses on his hands, and tomorrow he would rise with the sun to walk the rows again. Whatever strange twist of fate had brought Ethan Cole into Jacob Miller's life, he had used it to rewrite more than his own story. He'd changed the way an entire town thought about land, debt, and the word ours. And as the stars wheeled slowly overhead, he felt, for the first time, not like a man out of place in time, but like someone exactly where he was supposed to be. In the end, this story is not just about a farm boy becoming a billionaire. It is about a simple truth. When God gives you a mind, a pair of hands, and a community, you're never truly poor. Ethan used modern knowledge, but what changed everything was his courage to stand up, his decision to share, and his choice to say we instead of me. In our daily lives, we also face our own droughts, bills that scare us, pressure at work, fear about the future, moments we feel small and alone. This story reminds us that we do not have to fight alone. When we dare to think differently, when we help each other instead of pushing each other down, when we are honest and patient and keep going one more day, little by little God can turn a weak field into a full harvest. Like Ethan, we cannot control the rain or the market or every storm that hits our life, but we can control the way we respond. We can learn, plan, forgive, and keep our hearts soft. We can choose faith over fear, wisdom over panic, and community over selfishness. And when we do our best, we can leave the rest in the hands of the Lord. If this story touched your heart, I kindly invite you to share this video with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about what part spoke to you the most, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. May God bless you and your family with peace, wisdom, and open doors in every dry season of your life. If you believe that God can turn your drought into a harvest, write Amen in the comments.